everybody. Thanks for tuning in and listening with us today. Right now, I am joined on our podcast by Dr. Brandon Waite, who is an associate professor of political science at Ball State University. He's been here since 2008, and he has extensive coverage with relationships between media and the political world. So, Dr. Waite, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate having you.
Happy to be here.
All right, so let's dive right into it. So our main topic, right, is the incumbency advantage and how that plays a role in election results. Now, this idea it's not new. It's something that's been around for a long time, different ways that politicians who are already in these roles attempt to or have a leg up in anybody who attempts to unseat them, right? Now, something that's far less discussed is ways in which the media might actually provide challengers with some kind of advantages of their own during elections. So, first of all, do you buy that idea that is something that does occur, or do you just feel like there's not enough evidence to back up that?
And if so, how?
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, I think it would be overly simplistic to not to think that there aren't some times, right, when challengers have at least some advantage in the media. The media is never going to benefit one type of candidate over another 100% of the time, right? And so I do think that one of the things that we see with media coverage of politics in general, especially since the 1980s, since the rise of cable news, is that you get, these partisan outlets, whether it's Fox News on the right or MSNBC on the left, that tend to posit Congress especially, but even the White House, depending on which party and which outlet we're talking about, in really negative terms, right? That overall, the tone of coverage of politics has become more negative since the rise of 24-hour news cycles. Excuse me. I think that does lend some advantages to challengers, because when individuals are running for public office, we usually see campaigns mount one of two strategies, and these strategies are based on whether or not they're an incumbent or a challenger. Generally speaking, incumbents run a strategy based on being an insider, right? And all that entails is that, as an insider, they know the process, they know the actors, and, you're right, Washington is broken, but you need me to navigate these waters, right? I'm an insider. I know how Washington really works. And if you put in some outsider, right, some whippersnapper who doesn't know what they're doing, they're going to get eaten alive, and you, the constituent, are going to be at a loss, right? Because without a good advocate on your behalf, your services are going to decline, or the cost of those services is going to increase. If you have someone in here who doesn't know what they're doing, they'll be taken advantage of. That's why you need me, the incumbent, because I know the system. Well, given how negative so much coverage of our policymaking and our politicians is, I think that does lend people to be primed to think negatively of their government, and maybe that does lend a little more credence to the outsider perspective, which is more often a strategy used by non-incumbents who are trying to unseat incumbents to say, this incumbent, they've been there, half their lives, and Washington is awful, and they're the reason for it, right? They're part of the problem. You need a reformer. You need someone from the outside. And in that respect, I think that given the negative attention that the media, sort of the negative framing the media has of Washington in particular, but this I think would translate down the scale to state and local politics maybe as well, is that people are already primed to hate their current politicians. And so maybe that lends more credence to that outsider perspective, and maybe that does benefit challengers in a way that maybe they didn't benefit prior to cable news and prior to social media as another sort of outlet for that type of those types of stories. I think there are more opportunities for challengers to try and posit what they bring to the table and get that message across than there have been in the past. That said, there's a reason incumbents are still winning upwards of 90% of the time, and a lot of that has to do with media coverage, things like name recognition, things like being able to take credit for things that you've seen in the media, stories that you've read about, benefits coming to your district or to your state or to your nation that sitting incumbents can take credit for, there's a reason incumbents are still winning. So I would still put the favor in terms of incumbents, but I think there are some situations where the challengers can have some strategies they can pursue to make the most of the media environment that they're handed.
Absolutely. So that's a great take. Okay, so we've talked about this on a broad scale, right? I mean, we've looked at it just in a general aspect. So I want to kind of dive into some specifics. So I'm referencing a 1987 article from the journal Legislative Studies Quarterly, which is titled Mass Media and Congressional Elections. Okay, now this article makes the assertion that the incumbency advantage in the media is more prevalent in House races than in Senate races. Now, of course, this is over 30 years ago. And this is an assertion that I'm sure a lot of people have differing opinions on. What's your take on this?
So that not the incumbency advantage generally speaking, because I do think that we want to distinguish between the incumbency advantage sort of generally versus the incumbency advantage in the media. More generally, I think House members have a much greater incumbency advantage because they are representing districts, many of which are gerrymandered into their own favored constituencies, right? So more generally, I still think that House members have a much better chance of being reelected. They have a much greater incumbency advantage than say, senators. But within the media, that's a little more tough. So one thing is that as you go down the scale from president to senators to House members, that the further you go down the scale, the less knowledge citizens have of their elected leaders, right? Most everybody could tell you that Donald Trump is the president, right? I would even say, most people, probably a majority, can tell you who their senator is. You start talking about House members and you're losing people who maybe don't understand that. When you think about how that relates to an incumbency advantage, I think that House members typically rely more on local and state media than national media. And local and state media tend to give more favorable coverage than national media. So I do think that House members maybe have an advantage in that the types of media that are most likely to cover them are state and local, and that's where the most favorable coverage comes from. So that's where the advantage is in terms of that. Now, senators representing entire states, they have an advantage when it comes to name recognition in the media, but their senators are more likely to be covered by the national media than individual House members, given that they represent more people, given that they serve longer terms, they have special roles like confirmation roles. And so I think you're more likely, once you start talking about national media coverage, it just by its nature tends to be more critical, more negative. And so maybe that's where and I haven't read that article. I'll preface this with I don't know about that article. But I suspect that maybe that has something to do with it, is that senators typically maybe receive greater advantage. House members receive greater advantage because senators are more likely in the national news to be covered negatively, whereas House members are just less likely to be covered at all. Mm-hmm. But now that I say that, I'd be really curious to go back and look at that article and see if that's what they were arguing. Otherwise, I don't really know. I just don't know.
Sure, yeah.
I hate to say that, especially when I'm being recorded, but
right. No,
on that one, I just don't know.
No, it's fair. And I think a lot of people, like I said earlier, have differing opinions on it. You wonder how somebody like Mitch McConnell, for example, how his perception, not only nationally, but within his home state, may differ because of people's varying opinions for whatever reason they may be. And
especially with leadership positions, right?
Right.
That does change the nature of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that kind of highlights differences between the two chambers of Congress when it comes to this idea of the incumbency advantage. So now let's talk about two positions which are elected by the same populations of people. And we're talking about senators versus governors. Now, a 1994 article from the journal Political Research Quarterly, which was titled Gubernatorial and Senatorial Elections, these are just great academic titles,
right.
says this: from 1980 to 1992, only 11% of lowest profile challengers running against Senate incumbents were successful, while 24% of such challengers in gubernatorial contests won. Now, they attribute this to the higher levels of media coverage on governors as opposed to senators, thus allowing people to form stronger opinions about them and be willing to vote them out of office because they are more informed about the job they're doing. The idea then being that because you don't know as much about your senator, if you at least recognize the name, you're going to say, well, this is the comfortable choice. This is who I'm going with.
Whereas governors receive a lot more media attention, particularly at the state and local level. And a lot of that media attention will be negative, right? So it's kind of, I was just talking about national press having sort of negative context for politicians. At the national level, I think you see that amongst senators more than maybe House members. Maybe what we're doing is taking that same rubric and applying it just downriver, right? To say, okay, when we look at state offices, within state publications, they are less likely to defer to the executive in that state. That coverage is more likely to be negative of the state leaders, right? The governor's mansion, than senators. And I think that's probably true, although. So I think that's true. I'm not entirely convinced that that's what accounts for the fact that only 11% of the lowest profile challengers running against Senate incumbents were successful. There could be a lot of things outside of media coverage that make for those numbers. So I don't know how much of that I would attribute to media attention. But I do think it's interesting that they found that governors, received, or that they seem to presuppose that governors receive more negative attention than senators. That does make sense within local and state media markets.
Do you feel that? Obviously, this is kind of a separate tangent, but in terms of looking at how polls may impact the overall perception too. I mean, obviously, some states, you do have very popular governors who just, well, depending on their laws, may be continuously winning re-election, and there's no debate about their popularity. But then you have states that, perhaps are having some issues that then affect the overall perception. I mean, do you feel like it's a case-by-case basis, or can this blanket statement just be put over?
I don't know how much of a blanket statement you can put over all of it.
Right.
And it may be, and I don't know, I'd have to go look into the literature. It may be that we see more polling done on governors than senators. And those polls could be driving some of these differences as well, right? That if governors start to poll, as their poll numbers drop, maybe the frequency of those polls reinforces that drop, and as a result, they suffer more at the polls than senators who just don't see as many opinion polls come out between, the time when they announce and the election, and that those polls aren't driving a decline. But I don't know. I hesitant to give any blanket statements.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so we've discussed that. Now let's talk about something else where the media can be very influential within elections for incumbents and challengers alike, which is selling advertising opportunities to candidates, right? I mean, this is a very, very important aspect of all this, and we're seeing it even now with someone like Mike Bloomberg, who's spending hundreds of millions of dollars on campaign ads. And at last check, he's polling around third or fourth nationally in the Democratic primary after only being in this race for 2.5 months.
So when you've got as much money as Mike Bloomberg and you can just hammer the airwaves with your ads, it doesn't surprise me that he's doing as well as he has, being in the race as short a time as he has, given just anecdotally how many ads I have seen across social media, the airwaves. I mean, it's kind of funny. I cut the cable a few years ago, so I don't even have general cable. I get some things through Sling,
right.
The way a lot of young people do now. I'm young too, Daniel. But even having cut the cord and getting my news through Sling and online things, I mean, just the amount of advertising space he has bought. One way to look at it is to say, wow, he's in third place having not been on the stage that long. I'll tell you, I am increasingly, given how much he spent, surprised that he's not doing better than being in third place.
Interesting.
If you truly believe that money can buy elections, not just in terms of sort of raw money power, but money can buy advertising space, which can help lead you to win elections, Given how much he's spending, it surprises me he isn't doing a little better than he's doing. And I know there are a lot of Democrats on the inside that question whether or not he'd be better off saving that money and spending it on trying to win back the Senate, as opposed to running for the presidency. But that's a political strategy to leave to Democrats.
No, absolutely. Right. Well, I do want to reference one other article here. Now, this one is a little more recent than the last ones, but still fairly dated. It's a 2003 article from the journal State Politics and Policy Quarterly, and it's got a long title here, but I'm going to read the whole thing. It's called "Not All Money is Equal: The Differential Effect in Spending by Incumbents and Challengers in Gubernatorial Primaries." Now, this article found that campaign spending for challengers in these situations can help tremendously when they're trying to bolster name recognition and discuss their positions on different issues. So do you feel like this is actually the case in, whether it is in these instances or other instances in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're not an incumbent, you're facing so many obstacles to winning, and the first one of those is just name recognition. I mean, you're talking about Bloomberg, mayor in New York City. You're talking about someone who, we're not New York, but like New York City's a big city, right? I mean, you would expect that even of some of these major cities, these names might be more recognizable. Particularly someone like Bloomberg, who has been in the news, right? It's not like the mayor of San Antonio. Who's that,
sure,
right? I mean, New York City, people ought to be a little more attentive to just because of its place in the things that have been going on in the news. So I do think, in terms of blanket statements, I do think certainly challengers have a lot to get, maybe more to gain out of spending money, but they have more to accomplish too. Whereas incumbents, are wanting, they've already got name recognition. They're out there sort of talking about biography maybe more than their policy positions, because once you articulate a policy position, you start alienating people. Challengers need to not only get their name recognition out there, but they are more likely to articulate policy positions because they have less to lose in doing so. They don't have a voting record. So the chances of you saying, well, the position you just said contradicts a vote you took on before, that's less likely to happen. So maybe those challengers are a little more emboldened to speak about their positions because they have less to lose. They're not worried about contradicting previous votes the way that maybe incumbents have to worry about that. And I will say, in addition to just spending money in terms of mass media, some of the benefits that challengers are afforded now that have not been afforded, even in recent past, 10 or 12 years ago, is social media. The ability for challengers to use social media, which really is relatively low cost, at least in maintaining your own pages. And I know it starts to get more expensive as you take out advertising on social media, but those are tools that maybe are evening the playing field a little more than it has been in the past. When you're only talking about ABC, NBC, and CBS, incumbents, just by nature of their experience and being in government, have a huge advantage. But you start adding on to that all of these other sort of social media and online media, where now those challengers can have more direct, unmediated communication with the population, with citizens, that maybe that helps even the playing field some. But again, it may help even the playing field some. Incumbents are still winning an outrageous majority of the time. And we're talking, 90+% of the time. So, while challengers maybe have made some strides, and there are some new tactics and strategies that they can employ with new media and different ways of managing the media, and now you've got 24-hour news cycles with cable news shows, and there's some strategies that open up there. Even if they're better off than they were 20 years ago, they're still not better off than incumbents.
Sure, right? Absolutely, yeah. I do want to get back to social media in a second, but I do want to just kind of follow up with this. So, we live in Indiana, right? I mean, this is a historically red state. We have a lot of Republicans that are...
Now, wait a minute. I'm gonna push back a little bit.
Okay.
When you say a historically red state... we have had Democratic senators.
Sure.
We've had
the Byes. Yeah,
we had the
Donnellys. Yeah.
We had Donnelly. I will remind you that in 2000 and let me think about this. 2008, Obama lost the state, and in 2016 he came back and won the state.
Yeah.
So even in recent memory, we have had Republican senators, we have had the state go for a Democratic president.
Sure.
So I don't know that we are as red as sometimes conservatives in particular want to make us out to be. But it is certainly the truth that right now we're talking about Mike Pence being in the White House.
Right.
We've got 2 Republican senators,
Sure.
a state legislature that is dominated by Republicans. So fair enough, but I don't want us to, gloss over the fact that maybe we're not as red as some people would like us to believe.
Completely fair. The only point I'm wanting to make with this though is in states that tend to have one party that overwhelmingly dominates, and perhaps even overwhelmingly is a bit of a strong term too, but just dominates in general. And people who say, well, what in this state, what's the point of voting for a Democrat for governor? They're not going to win, even if they're not maybe the incumbent. Do you feel like that is partly the media's responsibility in creating that kind of an advantage, or is that just a historical preference on the part of the voter?
That's tough. Probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think sometimes you get into one of two things. Either my vote's a waste because, the state's clearly going to go for the Republicans. So if I'm a Democrat, why even turn out, right? I think there are also some people who believe that even if the Democrat won, if you got a Democratic governor, you're still dealing with a state legislature that's overwhelmingly Republican. And so even if they won, what would actually get done?
Sure.
Right? But I don't know that I afford these, I attribute them to the media so much. I don't know that we have, if I understand your question, it seems to be, is Indiana so conservative because the state journalists, the media outlets, have led us to be conservative?
Sure, yeah.
I'm not sure that's the case.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think there are other reasons we can posit why Indiana might vote red. I mean, we tend to have more agricultural economy that tends to benefit particularly on social issues, that tends to favor more conservative, politicians. But for all the things I might blame, for Indiana being a Republican state, I don't know that I'd blame the media.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. It's just had to ask, because I'm not sure how much that affects. I personally feel like there is somewhat of an effect on a national stage, and so perhaps there are differences.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back and talk about the social media, right? Because
that's my expertise.
Absolutely,
that's something I actually know a little bit about.
For sure. So now these 3 articles that we've been kind of discussing briefly here, they are all fairly dated, like I kind of alluded to.
I think all those articles are probably all written before you were born.
Oh, well before. I mean, the 2003, I was maybe 6 years old at that point, but nearly 20 years from the closest one that I referenced. So, our society is shifting. Like you mentioned, social media is becoming a larger player now. I mean, do you feel like, and you kind of touched on this already, I mean, do you feel like there are advantages there? We see someone like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who took out I think he was a 10-term congressman, high-ranking Democratic congressman in Joe Crowley 2 years ago. I mean, something that was absolutely not expected in any way, and she built a grassroots campaign that was heavily reliant on social media.
Yeah, so here's the deal. Political parties are weaker than they have ever been, which is sort of ironic because partisanship is arguably stronger than it has ever been, right? Partisanship is very strong, but the parties themselves are very weak. And what that means is that parties maybe have less control than they have in the past about who their preferred nominee is. I mean, we saw, going back a couple years here, we saw the Republican Party bend over backwards to try and stop Donald Trump. We see right now maybe some in the Democratic Party establishment bending over backwards to stop Bernie Sanders. And they can't, right? And they didn't stop Donald Trump. And I do think social media and online media, the media environment changing has something to do with that in particular. Because I think what happens is that now politics is increasingly less rooted around ideology. and partisanship. And it is increasingly more rooted in events and the flow of information surrounding those events, which means I think that as we go forward with social media, we are entering a stage where we're having more and more what I would call sort of post-bureaucratic forms of politics, which means that people who are able to sort of master social media and master, broadly speaking, the media, are able to break through some of those traditional advantages that incumbents have. And so I do think what social media has done is it has made American politics far less predictable than it has ever been in the past, which is why we're seeing, both on the left and the right with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And not to say there's equivalence between the two. I'm not comparing them in terms of their policies or their genuine, general goodness or badness. It's just that they are both indicative of a system where candidates who can generate a lot of buzz outside of the traditional system, which is in the parties and in traditional media, right, the broadcast media, that those traditional gatekeepers, whether they're in the media or in the party side, there's lots of ways around those traditional gatekeepers now. When the party says, look, if you don't get in line and vote our party line, or you don't get in line and preach our party platform the way we want it to be preached, then we're not going to help you get media attention. We're not going to help you raise money. We're not going to help you get volunteers for your candidacy. Well, when they're the only game in town, I do what they want, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when those parties and the traditional gatekeepers in media now come and say, well, if you don't play by our rules, we won't help you. And I say, what? You're not going to help me raise money? I'll get on Twitter tonight and raise $5 donations from a ton of people that rivals the money you would have given me, right? And you're not going to help me get volunteers? I'll get on Facebook and I'll put out a call for volunteers, a street team. And so now there's a lot more self-organizing, self-advertising, self-strategizing done by candidates, which benefits challengers over maybe some of those, the establishment, they've always had the establishment support to do those things.
Sure.
And if you were a challenger and you didn't have the establishment support, you were out of luck. Really difficult to overcome those challenges. Now, though, you build up a good Twitter following that isn't even necessarily tied to your geography. And this is the thing about AOC that I always find fascinating, is that beyond her own constituents, where does her power come from? It's not just her constituents. It's this wing of the party, this faction of the party that is a more progressive wing, a more progressive faction that is bought onto her. But she's throwing them red meat every day out on Twitter, right? And it builds a following. And so I do think that those outsider candidates, by harnessing the power of social media, are able to challenge establishment candidates, establishment politicians, and those gatekeepers more than they have ever been able to do in the past. And again, the parties themselves are very weak, but maybe the individual factions within parties are relatively strong. I mean, we saw that with the rise of the Tea Party movement, right? Where a lot of people thought that the Tea Party movement was a reaction against Barack Obama. The problem was the Tea Party movement predated Barack Obama. The Tea Party movement was a reaction against George W. Bush and his tax and spend policies, and his federal takeover with No Child Left Behind. That's what now then, they didn't like Obama either.
Sure.
But I think what you see is that as the parties become weaker, the factions, individual groups within parties, those ideological strains, they maybe have become stronger.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think this is going to drive the parties to their ideological extremes. You are seeing conservatives get more conservative. You are seeing liberals become more liberal. And part of that is, and I think we saw the questions about this with Donald Trump. We're currently seeing questions with this about Bernie Sanders is, as this happens, are we running the risk of parties and their voters, the rationale for picking candidates change? Where the rationale used to be, we need to pick a candidate who can win, right? And that, generally speaking, necessitates picking a more moderate candidate. That you can keep your base in line, but by picking a moderate candidate, you can pull over some of the disaffected moderate voters from the other side. Bernie Sanders is not going to pull over moderate Republicans in the same way that Joe Biden might. So I think that changes the nature of this too, is that the logic for selecting candidates now, fueled by Twitter, right, is not any blue will do. Right? Now, any blue will do. That's how you end up with a Michael Bloomberg. Mm-hmm. And the only difference between a Michael Bloomberg and a Donald Trump is that Michael Bloomberg's hat says "Make America Great," but it's blue. Right? I think that you've got a situation where more and more the litmus test is, are you a real Democrat? Are you a real conservative? Mm-hmm. Not can you win, mm-hmm. but are you one of us? And I think that is fueled particularly on social media, where these ideological, I'll say extremists, but maybe that's harsh, but these folks who are ideologically committed are able to sort of breathe life into a campaign in a way that hadn't been done previously prior to social media. Mm-hmm. So I do think that it's everyone now on the Democratic stage is trying to prove why they're a real Democrat, maybe more so than why they're actually electable. And I think that just proves that parties are weak, and that we're moving towards this sort of being able to coalesce online, on Twitter, a following that can raise money to drive you into an election. I mean, AOC is raising money to win an election, not just from her own constituents, but from liberal progressives around the country, in a way that's just going to make her want to be more and more liberal, to prove to them that she's the real deal that can get more money. And so I think both sides are moving more and more to the ideological extremes. And the question is, in a country with only two parties, where does that leave a majority of Americans who maybe aren't on either of those extremes? They're in the middle, but they're increasingly being given choices between candidates on those extremes.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions we may see now is, if Bernie Sanders wins the nomination, do we see a third-party candidate? Does a Bloomberg split off and say, I'm going to run as a third-party guy? Can you see a Bloomberg Mitt Romney candidacy forming? Maybe.
Oh, man.
Right?
And we got a hot take right there.
Yeah, there's your hot take. But maybe that's, this is the type of political space being opened up in the middle because of these other things going on in technology.
It really is fascinating to be living through something that seems it feels so different. But of course, I wasn't living in the 80s during the rise of cable. Not to date anybody, of course. But
I'm not old either.
Okay, one more question, then I'll let you go. So it may be hard to predict right now, right? And this may just be a pure opinion. But if we wake up a year from now and we have a Democrat in the White House, how much do you feel the media will have contributed to that happening?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, there's two ways to think about this. Okay, and how you think about this is largely going to be contingent on how you feel about Donald Trump. If you like Donald Trump and you feel like media coverage of Donald Trump has been very negative and liberal, right? This liberal media has just attacked him from day one, and they just haven't given him a fair shake. Then if we end up with a Democrat in the White House, it's going to be very easy to point to the liberal media and say, that's what undermined my presidential candidate, right? If you hate Donald Trump, you're still going to acknowledge that the media coverage of Donald Trump has been overwhelmingly negative, but what? You're not going to attribute that to bias so much as Donald Trump was a corrupt politician who sold us out to the Russians, and the media caught it, and they did their due diligence, which is what an independent free press ought to do. And so, they affected it by giving us the truth, right? And so in either of those cases, I think we can attribute the loss of Donald Trump to the media. I guess whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing is largely dependent on how you feel about Donald Trump. But given the importance of media, I mean, it's hard not to say they have some responsibility in the outcomes of elections, right? That's and that's an if we see a Democrat in the White House.
Right.
Democrats seem poised to snag defeat from the jaws of victory, right? So we'll see. But I do think that if Donald Trump loses in the next election, you will hear a lot of conservatives crow about the liberal media undermining the president, tilting the scales. But one of the things we see, if we track, I don't want to make your podcast go too long here, but if we track media coverage of presidential candidates, we usually see 3 phases of coverage, traditionally. We have not really seen that as much with Donald Trump. So we'll see if this carries through, okay, between now and the election. But the 3 phases we typically see are a president gets elected, and they're in a honeymoon phase. And the coverage tends to be very favorable. And that phase can last from a few weeks to a few months sometimes. Depending on landslide elections, it lasts longer, right? Then what happens is they're governing, and now suddenly the press attention turns more negative when we're talking about a sitting president. And so there's a period of sometimes years after those first few months of honeymoon where the relationship between the press and the president tends to be more confrontational. Then what happens is that as we gear up for re-election, the press realizes that it's likely facing criticisms of being too biased, whether it's liberal or conservative, depending on who the president is. And so what do? They try and overcorrect for that perception of bias by trying to be more objective when reporting on the president. So they go from being very favorable, press coverage tends to be very favorable, and then it goes negative, and then towards the re-election, it gets favorable again, just by nature of becoming more objective and less ideological, maybe. With Donald Trump, we haven't really seen those phases. It was negative from the minute he took office, right? But it was negative from the minute he took office because from the minute he took office, there were questions about his dealings with the Russians. There were questions about, his non-disclosure agreements with women. There were questions about his immigration policies. There were questions about all kinds of things from the minute he took office that maybe he himself shortened his honeymoon period. What we haven't really seen yet, but I suspect we're going to see some of it between now and the election, is do the media, when I say media, I'm thinking stations like CNN, which have been very critical of the president over the last few years. Do they try and move back to more of an objective, less critical sort of perspective as we get closer and closer and closer to the election? I suspect that we may see some of that, although Donald Trump's outright war with the media may mean that just like he didn't get much of a honeymoon period, that we don't see them returning to that type of favorable, more objective coverage towards re-election as well. But that's what I'm going to be looking for in the next few months, is are the media just as critical as they've ever been and they just continue to press and press and press, or as a function of either making it through the Senate, the impeachment hearings and not being removed from office, plus this turn towards objectivity, whether or not coverage could maybe actually benefit the president or not be as disadvantageous going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot to consider, and we still have a long way to go. And one thing is for sure, the incumbency advantage will be certainly on high effect here with this presidential election in particular. So we'll see how that ends up playing out. But Dr. Brandon Waite, we want to thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me on.
We appreciate it as always. And thank you all for everybody who's been listening. And we'll be back next week with our next guest, which is TBD. So be sure to tune in and we'll let you know who it is. Thanks.